Now, when Moses was called by God to lead God's people out of Egypt, he immediately had a laundry list of objections. He complained that he didn't know God's name. He worried that the people wouldn't listen to him. But there are two objections that stick out to me. The first one and the last one. The first one is what Moses says right at the end of the passage which Erica read. He says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" And the last one comes later in chapter 4. Moses objects by saying, "I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant. But I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Moses begins and ends his objections to God's call, essentially by saying he is the wrong person for the job. Now, these objections stick out to me because they are absolutely and unequivocally invalid. So who is Moses to go before Pharaoh and lead the Hebrews out of Egypt? Just a Hebrew orphan who happened to grow up in Pharaoh's house after being rescued from death by one of Pharaoh's daughters. And then there's this whole thing about him not being eloquent. So for a time, his brother Aaron does the talking for him. But by the end of Exodus, Moses is giving hella speeches. In fact, he is such a convincing speaker that he manages to convince God to change God's mind. And if you flip forward just a couple of books, you get to Deuteronomy, which is literally one giant speech by Moses. It's almost like Moses was actually a good speaker from the jump. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think Moses was just trying to get out of doing the big, scary thing that God was calling him to do. I think Moses simply suffered from something that we all suffer from. He didn't know himself well enough to really hear God's call. Now, this idea, God calling us, as Christians, we tend to talk about it in a couple of different ways. And the first is that there are things that God calls all of us to do. For example, as God's people, we are all called to make disciples of Jesus Christ. As God's people, we are all called to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. As God's people, we are all called to care for the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed. And these calls are just part of what it means to be a Christian. But we also talk about being called by God in more specific, personal ways. So Moses was called by God to lead God's people out of Egypt. Specific and personal. And it is often through these specific and personal callings that we actually respond to the more general call of God. So Moses, by responding to God's call at the burning bush, also responds to what God calls all of God's people to do, to execute justice for the oppressed. Now, in my life, I have found that hearing God's call on the first level, the general call to do justice and to be committed to the good of the world, that's actually pretty easy. It might not be easy to live out, but it's pretty easy to hear and to claim. As a Christian, you might say, I'm called to love others. Nobody's really arguing with that. It's that second level, that specific and personal level, where it gets hard to hear God's call and claim it for ourselves. And in my experience, one of the things that can make hearing God's call difficult is that we often do not know ourselves well enough to know what God might actually call us to. So Moses resists God's call with objections that don't actually line up with his reality. The eloquent Hebrew raised in Pharaoh's house thinks he's unequipped for the job of speaking to Pharaoh and leading the Hebrews. And so when God meets him at the burning bush, Moses resists, even though the calling makes sense. He doesn't know himself. And we, too, sometimes have misperceptions of ourselves that make it difficult to hear what God is specifically and personally calling us to do. We do not know ourselves as well as we could. And sometimes we even intentionally tell ourselves that we are someone we are not. And there's a book on this subject of calling that I love called Let Your Life Speak. It's written by someone named Parker Palmer, who coincidentally actually lives here in Madison and has even spoken at Press House. And as he reflects on the old Quaker saying which inspired the book's title, he says this: "My youthful understanding of let your life speak led me to conjure up the highest values I could imagine and then try to conform my life to them, whether they were mine or not. If that sounds like what we are supposed to do with values, it is because that is what we are too often taught. Vocation, that is, the things that God calls us specifically and personally to do, does not come from willfulness. It comes from listening. It is not a goal to be achieved, but a gift to be received. Vocation does not come from a voice out there calling me to something I am not. It comes from a voice in here, calling me to be the person I was born to be, to fulfill the original selfhood given me at birth by God." Now, there are many ways to hear what God might be calling you to. But one of them is simply by letting your life speak, by paying attention to where in your life you have felt tuned in to yourself, to God, and to others. I want to illustrate this principle of letting your life speak by telling you a bit of my own story, mainly the story of how I landed here at Press House. Now, during my last year of seminary, I developed a weekly Sabbath practice on Fridays. So every Friday after chapel ended, I would go downstairs to the prayer room on the lower level. And in this prayer room was one of the greatest things humankind has ever invented: a zero-gravity massage chair. And that's the chair. I had my friend go take a picture of it because it's that important to me. So every Friday, I would come down and sit in this chair, set the timer for 30 minutes, throw on some noise-canceling headphones, and rest. Sometimes I would pray, sometimes I would think or let my mind wander, and other times I would just sleep. And on this particular day, I was in sleep mode, gently slipping off into peaceful zero-gravity slumber. And then all of a sudden, just as I was on the verge of sleep, I had a sudden bolt of clarity. See, at the time, I had been preparing to apply to PhD programs in preaching. Yes, you can, in fact, get a PhD in preaching. But suddenly, sitting in my massage chair, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this choice was the wrong choice for me as my next step after seminary. And this experience of sudden clarity was so confusing that I immediately texted one of my mentors and asked her to meet with me to talk about it. A few days later, we sat down together in the corner of the library cafe. And after explaining to her what had happened, I asked her what she thought. And she said, "Me, do you think that you might be called to ministry with youth and young adults right now?" Now, to be honest, I kind of scoffed at this. It's a very common sentiment in seminary and even among pastors in the real world that youth and young adult ministry, campus ministry included, is just like a stepping stone to real ministry. And I'm a little ashamed to say that I had bought into that a bit. Calling myself a youth pastor or a young adult pastor or a campus minister seemed a little beneath me. And so I said, "No, I don't think so." And here's where things shifted. Abigail, my mentor, gently suggested that my life perhaps suggested otherwise. And rather than rehashing our conversation, I want to show you visually what she meant. Matt, you can go ahead and take that picture down. So, this is a timeline of my life. Very visually astute. So this is me when I was born, little knee. This is me when I was 12. If you want to see what I looked like when I was 12, there's an emoji in the Discord around this time in my life. And then this is me at 24 when this event happened. This X is me at age 10 when I started volunteering in my church's children's ministry. Now, every single other X on this timeline represents another moment or season of my life where I was doing some form of ministry or work with youth and young adults. Working at a leadership seminar for high schoolers, volunteering at a summer camp, working at a summer camp and mentoring staff, becoming a student leader in my campus ministry, working at an after-school program, taking youth ministry classes, teaching New Testament classes to college students. From age 10 to 24, that's all I had been doing. For more than half of my life, I had been doing youth and young adult ministry. For more than half of my life, the things that made me feel most in tune with myself and God all involved being a part of the lives and spiritual journeys of youth and young adults. So here I was wondering what I should do with my life when all the while I was already doing something with my life. My calling didn't come from somewhere out there. It came from here, from my own life, my own passions, skills, and experiences. And to hear this call, I just had to listen to my own life. Now, sometime later, I got a message from a professor about a job he thought I'd be interested in. It was a job where I'd get to build meaningful relationships with college students and help them explore and deepen their faith. Where I would get to talk about the connections between faith and justice, and where I would be supported in my own spiritual journey. And that job was the Associate Director of Campus Ministry at Pres House in Madison, Wisconsin, wherever the hell that was. Now, there is more to the story after this. I still had to apply and interview and wait not very patiently for emails from Erica about next steps. And I actually this morning went back and read some of those emails, and I discovered that most of the time I actually just didn't wait, and I emailed her first. But the point I am trying to make is simply this. I have learned to speak of my role here at Pres House as a calling, because I got here by listening to God speaking to me from my own life. And so today I want to end my sermon by inviting you to do the same. I want to invite you to take some time to listen for where God might be speaking to you from your own life. And here's how we're going to do that. So on your tables, there are sheets of paper along with some pens and markers. And the invitation for the next 5 minutes or so is to take a sheet of paper and make a timeline of your life. And on your timeline, I want you to mark moments or seasons where you felt like you were in tune with yourself and with God. Think about what you were doing at those times and how that might help you hear God's call in this time. Now, if your memory isn't quite up for remembering the rest of your life, because I know sometimes you can't even remember what you had for breakfast yesterday, That's okay. You can also just reflect more generally on your life, the things that you're good at, you care about, that bring you joy. And on the screen, there are some prompts to help you if you want to go in that direction. Now, this practice might be extremely helpful for you. It might not be helpful at all, or it might be somewhere in between. And no matter where you land, that's okay. There's no pressure to have any deep spiritual insight in this moment. This is just one way of listening for what God might be calling you to in this season of life or the next. So we'll do this for a few minutes, and then Erica will come up and lead us in